The bridge didn't blow. Why it didn't blow, I still don't fully know. German Captain Karl Friesenhahn said this in his post-war testimony. That day, his orders were to destroy the bridge. The Americans were right there on the opposite bank. March 7th, 1945. Remagen, Germany. The war had been going for 5.5 years, and every corner of Europe carried that weight. But on that particular morning, for the American soldiers standing on the western bank of the Rhine, the entire world had narrowed down to a single point. Across the water stood a bridge, the Ludendorff Bridge. It had been built in 1918, in the final years of the First World War. Iron and steel connecting the two banks of the Rhine, 325 meters long. Below it, the river ran cold and gray. Above it that morning hung a low curtain of mist. When the lead elements of the 9th Armored Division reached Remagen that morning and saw the bridge still standing, no one could quite believe it. Allied commanders had spent weeks planning how to cross the Rhine. They knew the Germans had been blowing every bridge one by one as they pulled back. Not a single intact bridge remained over the Rhine in the west until that morning. Captain Karl Timmermann raised his binoculars toward the bridge. His eyes narrowed. It was still there. Timmermann was 24 years old. He came from Nebraska. His father was of German descent, and in some way he knew these lands. But in that moment, only one thought moved through his mind. How much longer does this bridge have? He turned to the officers beside him. No one spoke, because everyone was thinking the same thing.
The strategic significance of the Remagen Bridge was immense. The Rhine River was Germany's natural defensive line. In this sector, the river stretched over 300 meters wide, and the Germans had been demolishing every crossing the moment their troops pulled back. If the Allies wanted to cross the Rhine, they would either have to construct pontoon bridges, a process that would take days, or seize an opportunity exactly like the one that had just appeared at Remagen that morning.
On the far side of the bridge, there were Germans. That much was certain. The questions were, how many, with what weapons, and how much time did they have left before the bridge went up? Timmermann kept his binoculars raised as he spoke. There's movement on the bridge, people crossing, but I can't tell which direction exactly. What was actually happening was this. The Germans were evacuating across the bridge. Civilians, soldiers, horse-drawn carts moving to the eastern bank. And somewhere beneath that flow of people, German combat engineers had spent hours placing explosives under the bridge's structure. The demolition plan was ready. The detonator was connected. All they needed was the order. Timmermann got on the radio and reached his division commander. He reported what he was seeing. The voice that came back was short and clear. If you can cross, cross. That order guaranteed nothing. No one knew when the bridge might blow. No one knew how many German troops were waiting on the far bank. Timmermann had a handful of men and 325 meters of steel bridge in front of him. He turned to face his soldiers. What he saw in their faces, he later described this way. Nobody wanted to volunteer. Honestly, neither did I, but somebody had to go. Gunfire was coming from the far side of the bridge. The mist hadn't lifted, and somewhere beneath the bridge, a German officer was holding a detonator.
On the German side, responsibility for the bridge's defense fell to Captain Karl Friesenhahn. Friesenhahn had only 36 men under his command, and the demolition system had already run into a critical problem. The primary electrical detonation circuit had failed. They were forced to switch to a backup fuse system. That transition cost them several minutes they didn't have. Minutes the Americans were about to use. In the history of this war, those few minutes changed everything.
Timmermann took the first step. When his boot pressed down on the wooden planking of the bridge, he felt a faint tremor beneath his feet. Not the wind, the bridge itself, the weight of years, the breath of steel. 3 men were with him. He hadn't chosen them. They were simply the ones standing closest. Sergeant Alexander Drabik, Sergeant Joseph Delizio, and a few others. Nobody spoke. There were only footsteps and the distant sound of gunfire. When they reached the middle of the bridge, an explosion hit. Timmermann dropped flat. His heart seemed to stop, but the bridge was still standing. The blast had come from a small demolition charge beneath the structure, not the main explosives. The Germans had fired the backup fuse, But something had gone wrong. The bridge shuddered, took some damage, but it did not fall. Timmermann raised his head. The bridge was holding. "Keep moving!" he shouted. That decision wasn't the product of calculation. The fear was real, open, and physical. But turning back was also a decision, and that decision carried its own cost. Timmermann got to his feet and started running. The men behind him got up too. 325 meters of bridge, under German fire, and American soldiers were running across it. Machine gun fire from the right, the iron railings ringing with bullet impacts. But no one stopped. Sergeant Drabik later described it simply: "You weren't thinking, you were just running. If you stopped, you died." That was it.
Why the German demolition system failed to fully function remains a matter of debate among post-war investigators. Some sources suggest the electrical circuit had been damaged by American artillery fire in the days prior. Others point to the backup fuse being too wet to ignite properly. In either case, the outcome was the same. The bridge could not be destroyed at full capacity, and a critical window opened for the Americans to cross. In the history of this battle, that window was everything.
Sergeant Drabik was the first man to reach the eastern bank. He had fallen while running, picked himself up, and kept going. Some of the men behind him had fallen back, but Drabik hadn't slowed. When his boots finally hit the ground on the eastern side, he stopped for just a moment. He had crossed the Rhine. He was inside Germany, but there was no time to register it. Fire was coming from every direction. Drabik pressed himself behind a rock and looked around. Soldiers were still streaming across the bridge behind him. Timmermann had made it too. The small group was trying to establish any kind of foothold on the eastern bank. The Germans were firing from above. The cliffs and tunnel entrance gave them a near-perfect defensive position. Every American soldier crossing the bridge was an open target. Timmermann grabbed the radio. "We're across. Bridge is holding. We need reinforcements. Now!" On the western bank, the command structure was trying to process what had just happened. Word reached Eisenhower. According to those present, when he heard the news, he went quiet for a long moment. Then he said one thing: "Get everything you have over there." Meanwhile, on the eastern bank, Timmermann's small group was barely holding on. Ammunition was running low. There were wounded men, and the bridge was still taking fire. But no one went back, because going back meant crossing those 325 meters again, and no one was willing to do that.
Although the seizure of the Remagen Bridge appeared in the moment to be a spontaneous tactical decision, its consequences were felt at the strategic level almost immediately. General Eisenhower ordered 5 divisions redirected to the bridgehead that same day. The Germans launched multiple counterattacks to retake the crossing, brought up artillery, and even deployed V-2 ballistic missiles against the bridge, one of the very few instances in the war where V-2s were used against a tactical target. The bridge itself collapsed on March 17, 1945, due to accumulated structural damage. But by then, the Allies had moved 25,000 soldiers and massive quantities of heavy equipment across to the eastern bank.
The bridge had been taken, but the cost was heavy. For the first 24 hours on the eastern bank, Timmermann's group was under constant pressure. The Germans were throwing everything they had at retaking the crossing. Artillery rounds were coming in, snipers had settled into the cliffs, and the bridge itself, already damaged by that first partial explosion, was growing weaker with every passing hour. Soldiers were being hit as they crossed. For 325 meters, you were an open target. Water on your right, water on your left, German fire from above. Running was the only option. Private First Class Marvin Jensen, one of the soldiers from Timmermann's company, described it this way: "The man next to me went down while we were crossing. I didn't stop. You couldn't stop. If you stopped, you went down too." That one sentence carries a great deal. Perhaps it was the most brutal truth of combat. You were forced to leave the man beside you and keep running, because stopping was not something you could afford. The soldiers who dug in on the eastern bank didn't sleep for days. Supply lines hadn't been fully established yet. Food was scarce. The cold March wind came off the river, and most of the men holding their positions in the trenches were soaked through. But the heaviest cost came from somewhere else entirely. On March 17, 1945, exactly 10 days after the bridge was seized, the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed. The accumulated structural damage had finally become too much to bear. 28 American engineers who were working on the bridge at that moment fell into the river. Some were pulled out, some were not. The bridge was gone, but by then, it no longer mattered.
Among all the methods the Germans employed in their attempts to retake or destroy the Remagen Bridge, the most remarkable was the use of V-2 ballistic missiles. This stands as one of the very few instances in the entire war where V-2s were directed against a tactical battlefield target. The Germans fired 11 V-2s at the bridge. Not one scored a direct hit. The bridge's eventual collapse was not caused by the missile strikes. It resulted from the structural damage sustained during the original partial demolition, compounding over 10 days of continuous use and enemy fire.
What happened at Remagen redrew the front line maps in a single day. Weeks of planning for a Rhine crossing operation, dozens of pontoon bridges, thousands of tons of equipment, entire divisions repositioned. All of it was still on the table. But Timmermann's small group, in an unplanned moment, had grabbed an opportunity no one had scheduled. Eisenhower wrote about that day in his memoirs. When the news from Remagen came in, my first thought was this: if we can hold that bridge, we could shorten this war by weeks. And that is exactly what happened. In the 10 days following the seizure of the bridge, 25,000 American soldiers crossed to the eastern bank of the Rhine. Behind them came tanks, artillery units, supply convoys. Germany's western defensive line had been broken open. In Berlin, when Hitler received the news, he had 4 officers executed, a brutal end for the commanders who had lost the bridge. But those orders changed nothing anymore. Timmermann returned to Nebraska after the war. He didn't give speeches, but he is reported to have said on occasion, "When I took that first step onto the bridge that day, I wasn't thinking about being a hero. I was just thinking about whether we could make it to the other side." That sentence is the essence of Remagen. The decisions that change wars are rarely the product of grand strategic thinking. More often, they come down to a single step taken in the dark, with no guarantee of what comes next.
The capture of the Remagen Bridge forced Allied command to revise its operational plans on the spot. General Omar Bradley described it as one of the most unexpected tactical opportunities of the entire war. The 10 days the bridge remained standing were enough for the Allies to establish a permanent bridgehead inside Germany. Military historians continue to study Remagen as one of the rare cases where an unplanned opportunity was converted into a strategic turning point, not through calculation, but through the initiative of a small group of men in the right place at the right moment.
Karl Timmermann came home from the war. 2 years later, in 1951, he was gone. He was 29 years old. Illness, Nebraska, quietly. The man who took the first step onto the Remagen Bridge had lived to see the war end. He didn't live to see much of the peace. Sergeant Drabick took a different path. He went back to Ohio, spent years in a small town. Journalists would occasionally show up at his door. "What did you feel that day?" they'd ask. Drabick's answer never changed. "I didn't feel anything. I just ran." That might be the most honest description of war ever given. The decisions that shape history rarely come from profound thought. They come from something rawer than that. Stop or run, cross or don't. Stay or go. Timmermann chose to cross. The Ludendorff Bridge no longer exists. Where it stood on March 17, 1945, only 2 stone tower remnants remain. The town of Remagen is small and quiet. The Rhine still moves the same way it always has, cold and gray. But those 2 towers have been turned into a museum. Inside there are photographs, documents, and the stories of soldiers whose names most people never learned. And near the entrance, a small plaque reads, "Here, on March 7, 1945, a few men stopped, then decided to run." Sometimes it isn't armies that end wars. Sometimes it's one person standing at the edge of a bridge, deciding to take the first step.
Remagen remains one of the most studied examples of split-second decision-making in military history. The Peace Museum, established at the site of the Ludendorff Bridge, draws thousands of visitors every year. Historians treat this episode not simply as a military success, but as a case study in how individual initiative, taken in a moment of uncertainty, without orders, without guarantees, can alter the course of events on a scale no one anticipated.